Early on the morning of February 14, 2022, police in the small Canadian town of Peterborough were called to a house on the outskirts. It was an ordinary home in a quiet neighborhood, with a neat green lawn and snow-covered porch, seemingly no different from others in this peaceful community. However, the interior scene sharply contrasted with the external calm. Neighbors had heard strange noises coming from the house the previous night, and one of them, worried that the screams might be the result of aggressive behavior, decided to call emergency services. When the officers arrived at the scene, they found the door open. The house seemed frozen in time, as if its occupants had suddenly interrupted their lives. There were traces of unfinished food on the kitchen table, a few cups of cold coffee, and red stains on the floor, distinct signs of blood. The scene in the living room forever shattered the perception that this was a safe home. The lifeless body of a young man, Anders McCall, lay on the carpet. Next to the body was an object that caused confusion and horror, a bloodied baseball bat. Anders was the son of Taylor McCall, a well-known businessman in the town, and stepson of Mark Johnson, a man who, as it later turned out, was not who everyone thought he was. The tragedy of that night seemed like a carefully hidden personal drama, gradually turning into something much more sinister. The detectives who arrived at the scene understood that this was a crime. There were no signs of forced entry, which immediately pointed to someone close who could have been in the house at the time. Initially, suspicion fell on Taylor himself, but after hours of questioning and verifying his alibi, investigators began to delve deeper into the family relationships. What they discovered was shocking. Taylor and Mark had married 5 years ago, when Anders was 18. At first glance, the family seemed close, and even Anders, despite his teenage resistance, appeared to accept Mark over time. They attended football games together, celebrated family birthdays, and always tried to maintain the appearance of a normal family. But the more the investigators spoke with neighbors and friends, the more dark secrets began to emerge. One of Anders's close friends revealed that over the past year, strange things had started happening between Anders and Mark. The friend was initially reluctant to speak, but, seeing the investigators' determination, eventually shared. Anders had mentioned several times that Mark was becoming overly intrusive, that their relationship had gone far beyond typical interactions between a stepfather and stepson. The investigators learned that there was a secret relationship between Anders and Mark that began about a year ago. It was an affair kept hidden from everyone, one that brought both pain and excitement to those involved. Anders was confused. It was difficult for him to understand his feelings in such a complex family situation. Mark, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy the power he had over the young man, relishing the risk and the taboo. But soon, it all turned into something much darker and more destructive. In the winter of 2022, according to Anders's friends, he was trying to end the relationship. He spent more time away from home, avoided conversations with Mark, and even spoke of plans to move to another city to start fresh. Such behavior could not go unnoticed by Mark, who apparently began losing control. Neighbors recalled seeing Mark standing on the street several times, watching Anders as he returned home late. There was something unsettling in his gaze, something on the edge between love and hatred. The investigators also found several disturbing messages on Anders's phone. Mark was demanding meetings, begging not to end the relationship, writing that he couldn't live without him. The last messages were becoming increasingly threatening. "You can't just leave. You know how this will end." These words seemed almost prophetic. As investigators began to take a closer look at Mark's life, they discovered that he was far from the ideal stepfather he appeared to be. His past was full of dark spots. Several years ago, he had been involved in an incident related to aggressive behavior, but managed to avoid punishment thanks to good lawyers. Now, all these details began to form a grim picture. On the night of February 14th, Anders apparently tried to end everything once and for all. He came home late after spending the evening with friends discussing his future plans. He wanted to move out the following month and rent an apartment in Toronto. However, Mark was home. They argued. At first, as indicated by the traces in the house, it was a verbal conflict. But then things spiraled out of control. Mark grabbed a baseball bat, the very one that usually stood by the front door as a reminder of Anders's former sports life. The confrontation ended in the young man's immediate death. At the moment when investigators were examining the crime scene, Mark was already being questioned. He behaved calmly, almost detached, but his eyes showed tension. When he was shown photos from the scene, he barely flinched. Despite all the evidence, however, he continued to deny his guilt, claiming that he arrived home to find Anders already dead. Nevertheless, the investigators had little doubt. The secret affair between the stepfather and stepson, full of contradictions and passion, was the reason for this terrible tragedy. Mark, a man who had lost control of the situation, could not accept rejection and, in a fit of rage, killed Anders. All that remained was to prove it in court. But it was at this point that the investigation faced another unexpected turn. When the DNA analysis on the weapon began, it became clear that the traces on the bat did not belong solely to Mark. There was someone else in the house, as it later turned out. The identity of this person remained a mystery for now, but their presence at the crime scene could change the entire course of the case. The situation was becoming increasingly complicated, and each new fact seemed to raise more questions than answers. The investigation into the crime involving Anders McCall began to unravel like a tangled web full of hidden and sinister threads. Officers understood that the situation was much more complicated than they had initially thought. The identity of the unknown individual whose traces were found at the scene remained a mystery, and this person could have played a key role in the tragedy that unfolded at the house on the outskirts of Peterborough. Questions were piling up, but there were too few answers. From the very beginning, the investigation focused on Mark Johnson. His behavior, his threatening messages to Anders, and the evidence of his presence at the crime scene made him the primary suspect. But now, with the appearance of an unknown third party, the situation took a new turn. Mark could have acted with someone else, or perhaps there was another witness or even participant in this tragedy. Investigators knew that if they wanted to uncover the truth, they needed to delve into every corner of this family's life. The work began with analyzing everyone connected to Anders and Mark. Friends, neighbors, colleagues, all of them were under the investigators' scrutiny. Detectives began interviewing everyone who could have been in any way connected to the family. One of the first key figures to catch their attention was Anders' girlfriend, Emily, with whom he had been dating for the past few months. Emily seemed anxious and scared when she was called in for questioning. She knew about the problems in Anders' family but did not suspect the true depth of the secrets that were hidden behind the walls of the McCall household. Emily revealed that a few weeks before the tragedy, Anders had mentioned that something strange was happening in the house. He said he constantly felt like he was being watched, as if someone was following his every move. He even suspected that Mark had installed cameras or was somehow tracking his movements. Emily didn't think much of it, believing that Anders was just being paranoid due to his strained relationship with his stepfather. However, now, after his death, those words began to sound entirely different. Investigators searched the house, checking every room, every corner, and to their surprise, Anders' suspicions turned out to be true. Hidden cameras were found throughout the house. The small devices were placed in the living room, kitchen, and even in Anders' bedroom. This discovery shed new light on the situation. The cameras were positioned to capture every movement of the young man, which meant that someone wasn't just watching him. That person wanted full control over his life. Who had installed these cameras? Everything pointed to Mark, but investigators knew they needed more evidence. Their attention also shifted to another possible participant, the unknown individual whose traces were found on the weapon. DNA analysis showed that it belonged to a man whose genetic material did not match anyone in the family. This was a clue that could lead to a breakthrough, but it required time and patience. At the same time, one of the investigators, while studying the family's financial records, discovered something unusual. Over the past year, Mark's bank account had received regular large money transfers from an unknown source. The sums were significant enough to raise suspicions. Investigators began to find out where this money was coming from and what role it could have played in the family's life. Perhaps these financial transactions were linked to the person who was in the house on the night of the crime. Another unexpected piece of evidence came from a neighbor, Mr. Clark. He noted that shortly before the tragedy, he had seen an unfamiliar vehicle near the house. It was a black SUV that parked further down the street and remained there for several hours. Mr. Clark saw a man get out of the car and quickly walk toward the McCall house. He couldn't see the man's face clearly, but he noted that the person behaved strangely, looking around and trying to stay in the shadows. This testimony became yet another thread in the complex web of events that led to the tragedy. Investigators turned to security cameras installed on neighboring houses. They hoped to identify the vehicle and establish the identity of the man Mr. Clark had seen. Reviewing the footage confirmed his account. The black SUV was indeed seen on the street on the night of the crime. The license plates were partially obscured, but they managed to determine part of the registration number. This gave them hope that they could track down this individual. Meanwhile, Mark Johnson remained in custody. He was becoming increasingly detached, avoiding conversations and insisting on his innocence. His lawyers claimed that the evidence against him was insufficient, that he was a victim of circumstance, and that someone else might have taken advantage of his conflict with Anders to commit the crime. But the investigators couldn't ignore the facts that pointed to his involvement. The cameras, the threats, his presence at the scene. All of it made him the main suspect. But now there was also the question of what role the unknown man played. The resolution of this story seemed increasingly complex. Secrets hidden within the walls of this house were being revealed one by one, but each new detail only added to the intrigue and confusion. Who was this stranger? Why was he in the house that night? And how were the large money transfers connected to the tragedy that unfolded in the McCall family? The answers to these questions could shed light on the true motives and help understand what really happened that fateful night. One of the investigators, a seasoned detective, knew that cases like this required patience. He understood that the key to solving the mystery could lie in the most unexpected detail. He decided to revisit Mark's past. Perhaps there were clues that could explain his actions and shed light on his connection to the unknown man. The detective managed to find old photographs showing Mark with another man, tall, athletic. These photographs were taken several years ago, and the man in them was clearly close to Mark. Was this a coincidence, or could this man be the one seen near the house on the night of the crime? Investigators began to gather information about the man in the photographs. It turned out his name was David, and he used to be a close friend of Mark's. But then their paths diverged, and no one had heard of David since. The detective began searching for David, understanding that he might be the key to the entire story. Soon, he found information that David had been involved in a series of minor offenses and had even been under investigation for extortion at one point. This discovery made his involvement in the case more likely. Once the investigators identified David, they began searching for him. It turned out that he was living a few hours away from Peterborough, in a small town where no one really knew him. His lifestyle was reclusive, and neighbors rarely saw him. The police went to arrest him, and fortunately, David was found at home. He acted nervously when he saw the police at his door. David was taken to the station for questioning. During the interrogation, David initially denied being in Peterborough on the night of the crime. He tried to assure the investigators that he had nothing to do with what had happened, but his words didn't match the facts the investigators had. When they showed him photos of the SUV and partially restored footage from security cameras showing him, David became even more nervous. He realized that his lies no longer made sense. Gradually, David began to tell his version of events. He admitted that Mark had contacted him a few weeks earlier and asked him to come to Peterborough. Mark was desperate, saying he could no longer control the situation with Anders, that he was afraid of losing everything. David, in need of money, agreed to help his old friend. He didn't know all the details, but understood that the situation was dangerous. On the night of the crime, he was indeed in the house, but he claimed he didn't kill Anders. He said he had come to support Mark, but when the argument started, everything spiraled out of control. According to him, he tried to stop Mark but failed. These words added even more chaos to the investigation. If David was telling the truth, it meant that Mark acted in a state of emotional turmoil. But could he have acted alone, or was David more involved than he was trying to show? Investigators realized that they now had another suspect and needed to determine who delivered the fatal blow, and whether it was a conspiracy or a momentary outburst of anger. The next morning, investigators gathered to analyze all the data they had. With each new discovery, the situation seemed to become more and more confusing. David remained in custody, and his testimony was now one of the key factors that needed to be verified. The question was whether he was telling the whole truth or hiding some important details. First of all, the investigators decided to check the hidden cameras that were found in the house. The device's memory contained recordings made several months before the tragedy, and they could provide valuable clues about what was really happening in the McCall household. The recordings became the main source of information that could shed light on the relationship between Anders and Mark, as well as David's possible involvement in their lives. On footage from one of the living room cameras, several arguments between Anders and Mark were clearly visible. These scenes confirmed the stories from Anders' friends and his girlfriend Emily about the serious conflicts within the family. Mark often behaved aggressively, shouting threats and trying to control Anders' every move. In one recording, Anders was seen trying to leave the house, but Mark blocked his way, threatening and demanding that he stay. These episodes showed how tense their relationship had become by the time of the tragedy. More importantly, one of the recordings captured a meeting between Mark and David. David came to the house late at night, about a week before the crime. The men were talking about something, their voices quiet, but their body language indicated the seriousness of the conversation. They argued. Mark looked worried, while David appeared cold and calculating. Although the sound on the recording was not clear enough to make out the entire conversation, it could be assumed that something extremely important, possibly threatening, was being discussed. The investigators continued to study the recordings and stumbled upon another important detail. On one of the recordings made on the night of the crime, there was another movement in the house. A camera in the hallway captured the moment when David entered the house. However, a few minutes later, the camera also recorded another person quietly entering through the back door. This person was wearing a hood, and their face was not visible. But their figure was different from Mark's and David's. The investigators realized that someone else was in the house that night, and this unknown individual could have played a key role in the tragedy. They began analyzing all possible traces that could have been left by this third person. There were traces in the house that had previously not raised suspicions, but now, after reviewing the recordings, they looked different. It turned out that there were signs of tampering on the back door, but they were so subtle that they had initially gone unnoticed. This fact indicated that the third person had not entered the house by chance, and their presence was planned. The investigators also began to thoroughly check the connections between Mark and David. It turned out that they were linked through a company involved in questionable dealings. The financial transfers that had been made to Mark's account were linked to this company. The company was registered to an offshore account, and its activities were shrouded in secrecy. This discovery provided a new motive for the crime. Perhaps Mark and David were involved in some illegal activities, and Anders had found out. His desire to leave the house and start a new life could have been linked to his knowing too much and becoming a threat to them. Further investigation revealed that the company was involved in money laundering and drug trafficking. Mark was apparently deeply involved in these activities, with David playing the role of liaison. Anders may have accidentally learned of the criminal schemes, and this was the reason for Mark's increased control and aggressive behavior. David, on the other hand, apparently traveled to Peterborough to help Mark solve the problem. Meanwhile, investigators continued their search for the third man. They circulated information about his possible appearance and began checking all available security cameras in the area. A few days later, they were able to locate footage of a hooded man getting into a black SUV near the McCall's home. It was the same car Mr. Clark had seen. The license plates on the recording were fully visible, and investigators quickly identified the owner of the vehicle. It turned out that the car was registered to a certain company that was also associated with Mark and David. The owner of the company, one Richard Collins, had previously come to the attention of the police because of his connection to criminal circles. Investigators decided to question Richard, and soon he was found in one of the suburbs of Toronto. Richard initially denied his involvement, claiming that his car had been stolen, but under the pressure of the evidence began to confuse his statements. During questioning, Richard revealed that he was indeed in Peterborough on the night of the murder. He claimed he had come at the request of David, who said he needed help. According to him, he did not know exactly what was going on and did not intend to get involved in the violence. However, when he saw the situation getting out of control, he got scared and ran away. Richard also mentioned that there was a struggle in the house, and it was David who grabbed the bat first. Mark was screaming, and Anders was trying to defend himself. This testimony added more complexity to understanding what happened that night. Investigators now understood that there were 3 people in the house: Mark, David, and Richard. Each of them played a role in the tragedy, but who exactly delivered the fatal blow remained unclear. Mark was motivated by fear of losing control and exposing his criminal dealings. David acted as an enabler, and Richard was thrust into a situation that was beyond what he expected. The investigators realized that they needed to gather even more evidence to reconstruct the exact chronology of events and figure out which of the 3 was primarily responsible for Anders' death. They went back to the camera tapes, trying to reconstruct every minute of that fateful night. On one of the tapes, they noticed that Anders had said something before the confrontation began, looking directly into the camera. His words were unintelligible, but it appeared he was trying to leave some kind of message. Investigators have called in experts to try to improve the sound quality and make out exactly what Anders was saying. If they were able to do that, they could get another important piece of evidence to help them understand what really happened. While the experts worked to improve the recording, the investigators continued to interview anyone who might have any information about Richard, David, and Mark. They learned that all 3 were connected through a network of illegal dealings, and each of them had a vested interest in keeping Anders from leaving the house and spreading information they could learn. But why did Anders choose to record his message on camera? Perhaps he realized his life was in danger and was trying to leave a trail that would help expose those who were threatening him. When experts were finally able to improve the quality of the recording, investigators heard Anders' words. He was saying, "If you see this, it means I'm gone. Mark and David, they're up to something. I don't know what will happen next, but please don't believe them." These words were important evidence to confirm that Anders felt threatened and realized that his life was in danger. He knew that his stepfather and David were planning something against him and tried to warn him about it. These new facts allowed the investigators to charge Mark, David, and Richard. They now had evidence that all 3 were involved in a conspiracy that led to Anders' death. Mark was charged with organizing the crime, David with participation and assault, and Richard with aiding and abetting. The investigation was finally approaching its conclusion, but there were still many questions that needed answers. After a month of intense investigation, all the evidence finally formed a clear picture of the events of that fateful night. Prosecutors began preparing for the trial in which Mark Johnson, David, and Richard Collins would face charges for their involvement in the crime against Anders McCall. All 3 were accused of varying degrees of responsibility for the young man's death. The community demanded justice, and this case became one of the most high-profile trials in Peterborough in recent years. The trial began in early July. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, Anders' relatives, residents of Peterborough, all wanted to see the outcome of this grim story. The prosecutor accused Mark of organizing the crime and manipulating Anders over a long period of time. David was accused of active participation and delivering fatal blows, while Richard was accused of aiding and attempting to cover up the crime. The prosecutor began by presenting video recordings from hidden cameras that Mark had installed in the house. These recordings became key evidence showing just how aggressively Mark behaved toward Anders. The videos showed Mark often threatening Anders, controlling his movements, and essentially trying to isolate him from the outside world. The recordings also showed David coming into the house on the night of the crime and how the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Special attention was given to the recording in which Anders left his final message. His words were a real cry for help, which the court took as crucial evidence of the threat to his life. Anders knew his life was in danger and tried to warn that his stepfather and David were planning something. This message became key evidence that helped build the case against all 3. David, whom prosecutors described as someone coldly helping Mark carry out his plan, tried to convince the court in his testimony that he was only doing a friend's bidding and did not intend to participate in the crime. He claimed that he had come to the house to calm Mark down and did not think it would lead to a tragedy. However, the prosecutor was able to prove that David's actions were not just an attempt to help, but a conscious decision to support Mark in his criminal intentions. Richard Collins, who initially denied his involvement, eventually admitted that he was in the house on the night of the crime. but insisted that he was not prepared for such a turn of events. His lawyers argued that he had been drawn into the situation against his will, and that his role was minimal. Nevertheless, the camera recordings and witness testimony indicated that Richard knew of the possible consequences and still chose to stay in the house, assisting David and Mark. Mark Johnson appeared calm, even detached, throughout the trial. His lawyers tried to portray the case as a tragedy that happened due to accumulated tension and stress. They argued that Mark lost control in a moment of emotional turmoil, and that the crime was not premeditated. However, the prosecutor presented evidence indicating that Mark had carefully planned every step, including installing the cameras and involving David and Richard in his plan. After several weeks of hearings, during which witness testimonies, expert opinions, and statements from the defendants were heard, the court delivered its verdict. Mark Johnson was found guilty of organizing the crime and intentional actions leading to Anders's death. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. David was found guilty of complicity in the crime and received a 25-year prison sentence. Richard, who played a less active role, was sentenced to 15 years for aiding and abetting. Anders's relatives, who were present in the courtroom, received the verdict with mixed feelings. On one hand, they finally got justice for their son and brother. On the other hand, the sense of loss and the realization that nothing could bring Anders back remained. Anders's mother gave a brief statement after the verdict was announced. She said she hoped that this trial would help other families avoid such a tragedy and that no one should have to endure such hardships. The story of a secret affair, control, and a thirst for power that led to the death of a young man became a lesson for many. The community discussed the case for a long time after it ended. It showed how dangerous attempts to hide one's true motives and control others can be, and the destructive outcomes of relationships built on lies and manipulation. The investigators who worked on this case also felt a sense of relief. They had managed to solve a complex crime full of intrigue and hidden motives. They knew they had done everything possible to bring justice to Anders and his family. This case served as a reminder of the importance of persistence and patience in investigations, showing that even the most tangled cases can be solved if every thread is followed, no matter how complex the web. When the trial was over and the defendants were sent to prison, the house on the outskirts of Peterborough remained empty. It became a symbol of a broken family and the dark secrets that were hidden within its walls. Neighbors avoided the place, and over time, the house became surrounded by rumors and legends. But for those who knew the truth, it was simply a house where a tragedy once occurred. A tragedy that could have been avoided if not for fear, a thirst for control, and an inability to accept the truth. Thus ended this grim story, leaving many questions about the nature of human obsession and how far people will go to keep their secrets. But one thing was clear. Justice had been served, and Anders McCall had finally found peace.